All right, in this video, I want to briefly cover a few topics that are of importance to German politics right now. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we had the local elections in Germany's largest state of North Rhine-Westphalia, and this included the city council elections, some local county councils, and also, of course, the mayoral elections. The mayoral elections are held directly where you have the two people with the most votes going into a runoff, and so we had, the elections initially 2 weeks ago, and then last Sunday we had the runoffs where the two people with the most votes went head to head to decide the final mayor of a lot of these major cities and also smaller ones. But here I want to just take a look at a few of the major ones. One of the biggest in the state actually by population is the city of Cologne, which has become along center-left stronghold of this state for a very long time now. The Greens have risen to prominence here, but we see in the runoff the SPD was able to win this election. It's likely that some of the CDU voters probably broke heavily for the SPD candidate, and even though the Greens have done very well in this city in federal elections and local elections, they were not able to win the mayoral election. The previous incumbent, Henrietta was, I believe, backed by the Greens, CDU, and FDP, but of course we had a different, composition now with different of the candidates. So the SPD won a victory against the Greens in Cologne, but this is of course a very different dynamic because both the SPD and the Greens have suffered a loss in the past federal election where we saw the CDU grow in strength, but of course that's not going to play out here because we have in this runoff a race between the SPD and the Greens, and that is, of course, the most significant one. We also have the city of Dusseldorf, which is the state capital, and here we actually had a decisive victory by the CDU. Dusseldorf is a major city. Most of the major cities are very favorable toward the more center-left parties, but the CDU is able to still win, and especially because of the gap in popularity between, the CDU and some of the center-left parties after the federal election. And even over the past several years after the unpopularity of the Scholz-Ampel coalition, we've seen that the CDU has been able to be very competitive in some of these cities when they are ahead in federal polling. And so we saw also there is the candidate factor at play. Some of the local candidates are probably going to have a further support than maybe the CDU does as a party. So the state capital of Dusseldorf was a decisive victory for the CDU. And the CDU did also win in a few areas that are former kind of SPD strongholds. The city of Dortmund, the CDU candidate narrowly won by 5 points ahead of the SPD. It's not totally abnormal for the CDU to win in the Ruhrgebiet. It is possible for them. They are still a major party, and you still have maybe some people on the left that don't view the SPD as left-wing enough, but it does show that the SPD is weak. They should be reliably winning a lot of these seats. So, this is not too significant, but this shows, the reality of the situation that the SPD is struggling with popularity, and the CDU at least is ahead of them, in a head-to-head situation. We also have the city of Essen here again. This is a city that is reliable for the SPD, but they're not going to win every time. And when they're struggling on the federal level or just in general in German politics, they're going to struggle also on the local level. But here we see a bigger margin. The CDU won in this city of Essen. And so we can see from these cities is we see that when the SPD and Greens go head-to-head, the SPD is somewhat favored, but when the CDU and SPD go head-to-head in the rural areas and even in some of the more major cities, the CDU comes out on top. Now, some of the other elections we had were between the SPD and the AfD. Now, the AfD, of course, has a very difficult time winning any runoffs, even in West Germany, because all the other parties coalesce behind the non-AfD candidate and back them. Most of the parties, of course, all of the parties pretty much refuse to work with the AfD, and they consider them too extreme to even cooperate with. And so we see that all the other parties, the SPD, the CDU, Greens, FDP, coalesce behind the candidate that's not the AfD. And similar to what we see in East Germany, but a larger margin, we see what's happened here in Duisburg. We saw the SPD win around 80% against the AfD's 21%. We also had the city of Gelsenkirchen. Now, Gelsenkirchen, the AfD did actually achieve a significant result, even though they only won 33% of the vote. 2 years ago, this is what they would receive in a East German city. I believe in the mayoral election for Schwerin, the capital of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, you had Erich Holm run from the AfD, and I believe in the second round he achieved something similar, around 34% of the vote. So the fact that the AfD is able to win, above 30% in the runoffs, even though it's a landslide loss, even though they're losing by a wide margin. These are numbers that they were at in East Germany just a few years ago, and it does show that the AfD is able to be competitive, and maybe in the future will be able to get closer. But it's going to be a very long time, if they are ever able to be able to win a direct election in a West German city. They've done it in a few small towns and villages in the east, but it's still very hard because all the other parties coalesce behind them. So those are just some of the cities I wanted to cover. There's also the city of Aachen, where the Greens had a mayor and they lost towards the CDU. So we see in the runoffs kind of a general trend. The CDU is not necessarily super popular, but when this election was previously held, the SPD and Greens were kind of on the high, and the CDU had lost a lot of support. And so we see that the CDU is beating the Greens and the SPD in a lot of these places. But of course, when it's the SPD going against the Greens, they have a better chance. And when it's the SPD going against the AfD, they have pretty much a guaranteed win in the runoff. Now, another story I want to take a look at actually revolves around a mayoral election in Ludwigshafen in the state of Rhine-Westphalia. There were some cities and local areas that had elections, that don't vote with the whole state, and they're aligned. The timing of it might align with the first round, but it didn't align with the second round. And so we had an election in the city of Ludwigshafen, and here the AfD actually did very well at the 2025 federal elections back in February. We had a very interesting situation where the Constitutional Court determined that the AfD candidate could not run. And they said this because they were unsure of his constitutional loyalties. They used kind of the same arguments that some people use for banning the AfD. They considered it to maybe a candidate to be not aligned with the German Constitutional Court and to be maybe too extreme. And what the significance of this is this now provides somewhat of a precedent towards maybe banning the AfD or excluding AfD candidates from elections. This, of course, is very controversial. There's many people within the AfD, who is now the second or even the largest party in the country, who oppose this. Many people who aren't in the AfD who maybe thought this was unfair, but a lot of people have supported this. So this is going to further, provide, add fuel to the whole fire and the discussion of whether or not the AfD should be banned, and this is going to basically further the chances of that being a political issue in the future. And so, if we take a look at the results, we saw that the AfD candidate was banned, and in the first round, the CDU candidate won 41%, and the SPD candidate won 35%. So there will be a runoff, I believe, in a few weeks, or maybe in 1 week, and the CDU and the SPD will go head to head. Now, of course, the fact that the AfD was not allowed to compete in this election did have an impact, and we see that the turnout in this mayoral election was only 29.3%. Now, local elections do have lower turnout than state or national elections for the most part. However, this is a very low number, and does show that a lot of the AfD voters didn't end up voting in this election. And this has created a lot of controversy, because, of course, there's people on both sides, people that now are going to be emboldened by this to say that, we should use this as precedent to further ban AfD candidates. But of course, if that happens, German politics will be in completely uncharted waters. The AfD is now the second or even the largest party in the polling, and they, of course, are going to oppose it. There's many people from maybe the BSV or elements of the CDU who do not want to go through with trying to ban the AfD. So if that does happen, if we do get to that, there's going to be somewhat of a political and constitutional crisis in Germany. But this was somewhat of an important story. It kind of garnered some international attention, so I did want to cover it. But we will, of course, if there's any more developments or any more developments regarding to the constitutional courts or to maybe a ban of the party or how that debate unfolds in the Bundestag, we'll of course cover that, because it is going to be impactful no matter what happens. If the German political class decides to go forward with this, it's going to change politics in a way that no one really understands. I mean, even people poll or people who've studied this is completely a new scenario in German politics. So this is a kind of a foreshadowing of what might happen in the future. But the last thing I want to look at, and this applies to what I was saying about the AfD being the largest or second largest party in the country, is the AfD has somewhat, it's not necessarily surged, but they've gained some ground in polls over recent days. They actually made it for the first time into first place in the aggregate. Now, they've polled first place in individual polls, but they made it to ahead of the CDU in the average between all of them, but they've fallen back to basically a tie. But this is still very significant, because the AfD at the last election, came 8 points behind the CDU in second place, and it's been less than a year, and the AfD is now on track with the CDU. They are now on par with the party of Germany's chancellor, and could very well potentially be the largest party in the country if there is a snap election held. And it is very difficult for them to hold any party to hold a lead in the polls for years until the next election. But this is still very significant, because if you take a look, 4 years ago, at the previous, in September of 2021, they got 10%. Polls are after and before then, they even fell down to 7-8% of the vote. And so the fact that we are now talking about the AfD potentially being the largest party in the country is very significant. And that is, of course, going to play a lot into whether or not people want to go through with a party ban, because people might say that now the AfD is becoming the largest party, you have to ban them. And some people are going to say that obviously banning them as the largest party is going to look very badly. And then obviously there's also the fact that now that they are the largest party, they're going to have a lot of support. There's going to likely be even more people who are virulently against anything, banning the party. So, but these are the polls as they are now. Of course, there's not going to be a federal election for a long time, assuming there's no snap elections, but we have the AfD and the CDU both polled around 25%. The SPD still lagging far behind at 14.7%, and then the Greens and Die Linke are kind of tied together. These are okay results for the various left-wing parties. For Die Linke, this is pretty decent. They've solidified themselves over, almost in double digits now, which is a very big comeback from almost going politically extinct. And the BSV and the FDP are definitely struggling, and we'll have to use some of the maybe more local or state elections in the next few years to see if they can manage to recover their results. So that's going to be it for this video. I wanted to cover just some of the local elections, and that's going to be it. If we have any more updates or any more significant polls, I will cover them. The next major state elections that will occur in Germany are in March of 2024. So we have 6 months until the next major state election in Germany, but I'll maybe cover some other polls or some news from other countries until then. So that's going to be it for this video. If you do, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you all for watching.